Imagine a world teetering on the brink, a nation consumed by endless war, its people desperate for a savior. Now, imagine that savior emerging not from the ranks of seasoned knights or cunning kings, but from the humble fields of a forgotten village. A teenage girl, illiterate, unversed in the arts of war, claiming to hear the voice of God himself. This isn't myth. It's the astonishing truth at the heart of one of history's most improbable sagas. For over 70 years, the 100 Years' War had bled France dry. Its king, uncrowned and besieged, held only a fraction of his rightful lands. English arrows had decimated French chivalry, and the once proud kingdom lay fractured, demoralized, and on the verge of total collapse. Despair was a tangible presence, thicker than the fog over the Loire. Yet, amidst this gloom, an ancient prophecy echoed that a maiden from Lorraine would save France. Then, from the obscure village of Domrémy, a young woman named Joan stepped forward. Barely 17, she declared a divine mission to lead armies, lift the siege of Orleans, and see the Dauphin crowned king of France at Reims. It was an audacious, impossible claim that defied all logic, all military convention, and every societal expectation of her time. How could a simple peasant girl convince hardened commanders, skeptical nobility, and a desperate king to entrust her with the fate of an entire nation? How did she inspire flagging troops to impossible victories, turning the tide of a century-long conflict? This documentary, Joan of Arc, the teenage girl who led armies, crowned a king, and changed history, delves into the extraordinary life of a figure who defied every boundary. We will journey through a land scarred by conflict, explore the profound faith that guided her, and witness the strategic brilliance that astonished her contemporaries. Join us as we uncover the forces, both worldly and otherworldly, that propelled Joan from obscurity to legend, ultimately reshaping the very fabric of European history. By the early 15th century, France was a nation on its knees, ravaged by a century of war, disease, and political turmoil. The 100 Years' War, a brutal dynastic struggle against England, had bled the kingdom dry. Vast swathes of French territory, including the capital Paris, lay under English occupation or Allied Burgundian control. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 had disinherited the legitimate heir, Charles, the Dauphin, naming the English king Henry V, and later his infant son, as the rightful successor to the French throne. France was fragmented, its nobility squabbling, its people despairing. The Dauphin, a fragile and indecisive figure, huddled in Chinon, his claim to the crown hanging by a thread, uncrowned and powerless. It was a dark, desperate hour when all hope seemed lost, and the very concept of a unified France teetered on the brink of oblivion. Amidst this national catastrophe, far from the battlefields and political intrigue, a quiet life unfolded in the small, pastoral village of Domrémy, nestled in the Duchy of Bar. Here, in 1412, a girl named Jeanne d'Arc, or Joan, was born. She was a peasant's daughter, raised in a deeply religious, close-knit community. Her days were spent much like any other girl of her time, tending to livestock, learning household chores, and devoutly attending church. Her parents, Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romee, instilled in her an unwavering Catholic faith that would become the bedrock of her extraordinary journey. Joan's world was one of simple rhythms, untouched by formal education, yet steeped in spiritual devotion. She was an ordinary girl, an improbable heroine, whose destiny would soon violently collide with the fate of an entire nation. But Joan's simple life was about to be irrevocably altered. At around the age of 13, while in her father's garden, she began to hear voices and see visions. They were, she claimed, the voices of Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, divine messengers who delivered an impossible command. She must save France and ensure the Dauphin's coronation. Initially, Joan wrestled with doubt, a young girl burdened with such an immense, inconceivable task. Who would believe her? Yet, the messages grew clearer, more persistent, infused with an undeniable urgency. The divine calling became an unwavering conviction, transforming a pious peasant girl into a vessel of God's will. She understood then that her path was not her own, but one ordained by heaven itself, for a purpose greater than she could possibly comprehend. Unbeknownst to Joan, her divine calling resonated with an existing undercurrent of hope circulating throughout the fractured kingdom. For years, prophecies had spoken of a virgin from the marches of Lorraine who would arrive to save France, a nation that a woman, Queen Isabeau, had supposedly brought to ruin. One such prophecy, attributed to the medieval seer Merlin, claimed a maid would come to lead the nation. These deeply ingrained beliefs, fueled by desperation, created a fertile ground for Joan's eventual acceptance. Her extraordinary claim was not entirely without precedent in the popular imagination. She was not just a girl with voices. She was the embodiment of a long-awaited miracle, a symbol of hope that France desperately needed, preparing the hearts and minds of a war-weary people for the impossible. Armed with unshakable faith and the conviction of her voices, the then 16-year-old Joan embarked on her first critical mission, to convince Robert de Baudricourt, the garrison commander of Vaucouleurs, to provide her with an escort to the Dauphin. She arrived in the spring of 1429, a simple peasant girl confronting a seasoned military man. Baudricourt, predictably, dismissed her, suggesting she be sent home and spanked. Yet Joan persisted. Her unwavering certainty, her detailed knowledge of future military events revealed by her voices, and her growing local reputation eventually began to sway not only Baudricourt, but also key figures like Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy. This remarkable tenacity, this quiet strength against overwhelming skepticism, marked her first true step towards fulfilling her divine, improbable destiny. As Joan prepared for the perilous journey to Chinon, a crucial and controversial decision was made. She would cut her hair short and don men's attire. This wasn't merely a symbolic gesture. It was a pragmatic choice born of necessity. Traveling through war-torn lands infested with brigands and enemy soldiers, a young woman alone, even with an escort, was incredibly vulnerable. Men's clothing offered protection, anonymity, and a greater freedom of movement, allowing her to ride astride a horse more easily. Yet, in a deeply religious and conservative society, cross-dressing was considered an abomination and blasphemous. This act, driven by practical need, would later become a focal point of her trial. But for now, it was a necessary transformation for the Maid of Orleans to begin her legend, shedding the vulnerability of her gender for the demands of her mission. With her new appearance and a small, dedicated escort, Joan set out on an 11-day, 300-mile journey across France. This was no mere trip. It was a perilous passage through enemy-held territory, requiring stealth, courage, and divine protection. Avoiding main roads, they traveled mostly by night, navigating through hostile Burgundian lands, past English garrisons, their lives constantly at risk. Every whispered rumor of a maid riding to save France, every act of defiance against the overwhelming odds began to build the legend around her. Peasants glimpsed her, and word spread like wildfire. By the time Joan reached Chinon in early March 1429, her very presence had become a beacon of hope, a tangible sign that the prophecy was unfolding, transforming a dangerous trek into an epic odyssey of burgeoning faith and a nascent legend. Upon her arrival at Chinon, Joan faced her first great test. The Dauphin, Charles, skeptical and perhaps fearful, attempted to trick her. He reportedly disguised himself among his courtiers, placing another man on the throne. The great hall was ablaze with candlelight, filled with dozens of noblemen, all vying for attention. But Joan, guided by her unwavering voices, walked directly through the throng. Her gaze cut through the opulent confusion, past the pretenders to the true Dauphin, humble and hidden in the crowd. She knelt before him, delivering a private message from God that deeply affected Charles, though its exact contents remain a mystery. In that moment, the peasant girl from Domrémy, through divine revelation, had seen through the facade, proving her extraordinary connection and validating her impossible mission. A new chapter in French history had begun. Before any sword could be drawn or army led, Joan faced her first, and perhaps most daunting, battle, a theological examination at Poitiers. For 3 weeks, a council of the kingdom's most prominent scholars and churchmen relentlessly questioned her, testing her faith, her sanity, and the very source of her claims. They sought to expose a fraud, a madwoman, or worse, a heretic. Yet, this illiterate peasant girl, barely 17, confounded them. Her answers were sharp, her conviction unshakable. When pressed for a sign, she prophetically declared that she would lift the siege of Orleans. Her unwavering belief in her divine mission, her directness, and her surprisingly astute theological responses ultimately convinced these skeptics that she was indeed sent by God, clearing the path for her to command. The impossible was beginning to take shape. With royal approval secured, Joan's transformation from peasant girl to warrior saint began. Practical preparations were meticulous. A bespoke suit of plate armor, crafted to her youthful frame, was commissioned, its steel glinting with the promise of protection. Her sword, she claimed, was found behind the altar of Saint Catherine de Fierbois, a relic imbued with symbolic power. But it was her banner that truly captured the imagination. Bearing the images of God, angels, and the names Jesus Maria, it was not a weapon of war, but a sacred standard, a visible manifestation of her divine mandate. This wasn't merely outfitting a commander. It was the ceremonial arming of a divinely appointed deliverer, turning a symbol of hope into a tangible force. The Maid of Orleans was ready. As Joan prepared, France teetered on the brink. Orleans, a vital strategic stronghold on the Loire River, had been under relentless English siege since October 1428. Its fall would not only open the entire south of France to English conquest, but also crush the already fragile morale of the French people, effectively signaling the end of an independent French kingdom. The English, commanded by Lord Salisbury and later Suffolk, had established a ring of formidable bastilles around the city, slowly strangling its defenders. Inside, the French garrison, led by the steadfast Jean de Dunois, the bastard of Orleans, was starving, exhausted, and losing hope. They fought valiantly, but despair was a stronger enemy. Orleans was France's last hope, and its demise seemed inevitable. Then, on April 29, 1429, the impossible occurred. Under the cover of night, a small relief force, led by a teenage girl in gleaming armor, slipped into Orleans. Joan's arrival was not merely a tactical reinforcement. It was a psychological earthquake. Carried by the cheers of an ecstatic populace, Joan, astride her white horse and bearing her sacred banner, rode through the torch-lit streets. The beleaguered citizens, on the verge of starvation and surrender, surged around her, desperate to touch her, to believe. Their despair was instantly replaced by a fervent, almost miraculous hope. The grizzled Commander Dunois, initially skeptical, quickly witnessed her profound impact. Joan had not yet struck a blow, but she had already ignited a spark that would soon become a roaring fire, transforming the spirit of a city on its knees. Joan's impact was immediate and aggressive, rejecting the cautious, protracted strategies of the seasoned French commanders. She insisted on direct action. Her first engagements were swift and daring assault on the English bastilles, the fortified outposts strangling Orleans. Against English strongholds like St. Lou and St. Jean-le-Blanc, Joan led from the front, her presence an electric charge through the French ranks. She wasn't merely a figurehead. She was a warrior, fearlessly scaling ladders, rallying wavering troops with her unwavering courage. Her tactical insights, though seemingly impulsive to the traditional generals, proved remarkably effective. These initial skirmishes shattered English complacency and injected a vital, aggressive spirit into the French, proving that the Maid was not just a symbol, but a formidable force on the battlefield. The decisive moment came with the assault on Les Tourelles, the heavily fortified English gatehouse and bridgehead controlling access to Orleans from the south. This was the linchpin of the English siege, and its capture was paramount. On May 7th, 1429, the battle raged with ferocious intensity. Joan, once again leading the charge, was struck by an arrow, piercing her shoulder. The French troops faltered, fearing their maid was lost. But in a moment that solidified her legend, Joan, after quickly tending to her wound, returned to the fray, seizing her banner and inspiring her men to a final, overwhelming assault. With renewed fervor, the French stormed Les Tourelles, driving the English back across the Loire. The fortress fell, a monumental victory. The morning of May 8th, 1429, dawned on a silent, empty landscape. The English, demoralized by the fall of Les Tourelles and Joan's seemingly supernatural resilience, had abandoned their siege. The ring of bastions lay deserted, their fires smoldering. Orleans was free. The jubilation within the city was instantaneous and overwhelming. Bells rang, prayers ascended, and the beleaguered populace poured into the streets, celebrating what could only be described as a miracle. In less than a week, a teenage girl had achieved what seasoned generals had failed to do in months. Joan's reputation as the Maid of Orleans was forever etched into history, her divine mission seemingly confirmed. The psychological tide of the 100 Years' War had turned, irrevocably, in France's favor. The liberation of Orleans was just the beginning. Joan's strategic vision extended beyond the city walls. She immediately pressed for Charles VII's coronation at Reims, the traditional crowning place of French kings. To achieve this, the English and Burgundian forces occupying the Loire Valley had to be neutralized. What followed was a swift, brilliant military offensive known as the Loire Campaign. Within weeks, Joan and her commanders, including Dunois and the Duke of Alençon, systematically cleared the region. Victories at Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, and Beaugency swiftly followed. The climax came at the Battle of Patay, where the French vanguard, led by La Hire and Xaintrailles, annihilated a significant English force. The path to Reims, once unthinkable, was now open, illuminated by Joan's relentless drive and unwavering faith. With Orleans liberated and the English reeling, Joan's focus shifted to her divine mandate, to lead Charles VII to Reims for his coronation. This was no mere parade. It was an audacious march deep into hostile, English-occupied territory, a journey fraught with peril through towns still loyal to Burgundy or the English. Yet, under Joan's unwavering conviction, the army moved. Her presence was a living prophecy, a visible sign of God's favor, inspiring awe and submission where defiance might have reigned. Fortified towns opened their gates without a fight, seeing not just an army, but destiny itself approaching. This sacred pilgrimage to Reims was more than a military maneuver. It was a powerful act of reclaiming France's spiritual and political heart, a defiant statement against centuries of foreign encroachment, all orchestrated by a teenage girl. On July 17th, 1429, the magnificent Reims Cathedral bore witness to history. The prophecies were fulfilled. The impossible had become reality. Charles VII, once the timid Dauphin, now stood as King of France, anointed with holy oil, crowned with the sacred crown, and hailed by his people. Joan of Arc, the architect of this moment, stood proudly by his side, her battle standard held aloft. Her mission from God seemingly complete. The cheers that echoed through the ancient stones were not just for a king, but for a nation reborn, for a hope rekindled by a miracle. This coronation, forged in the crucible of war and legitimized by divine intervention, forever changed the course of French history, solidifying Charles's reign and Joan's legendary status. With the crown firmly on his head, Charles VII's priorities subtly shifted. The urgent, divinely inspired zeal that had propelled him to Reims began to wane, replaced by the cautious pragmatism of court politics. His advisors, particularly the powerful La Tremoille, viewed Joan's continued military aggression as a dangerous gamble, preferring diplomacy and consolidation to another costly siege. Joan, still driven by her voices, pushed for an immediate assault on Paris, the true capital. But the newly crowned king, surrounded by seasoned, cynical politicians, saw a different path. A palpable tension emerged, the unwavering faith of the Maid against the calculated maneuvers of a court more accustomed to intrigue than miracles, a crossroads where Joan's influence began its slow, perilous decline. Joan's fervent desire to liberate Paris, the very heart of France, was met with royal ambivalence. Charles VII and his advisers, wary of another direct confrontation, provided only reluctant and insufficient support. Undeterred, Joan led her forces in a desperate assault on the city's formidable walls in September 1429. It was a brutal, chaotic engagement. Arrows rained down, siege engines thundered, and soldiers clashed at the ramparts. In the thick of the fighting, Joan was struck by an arrow in the thigh, a painful and demoralizing blow. With mounting casualties and inadequate reinforcements, the attack faltered. Charles, instead of committing further, ordered a retreat, leaving Paris firmly in English hands. This strategic misstep marked a devastating turning point, a profound setback for Joan and a moment of growing doubt in her divine mission. Despite the setback at Paris and the cooling support from the king's court, Joan continued to campaign, leading smaller skirmishes and defending French towns. Her influence, however, was undeniably waning. The moment of her downfall arrived on May 23, 1430, during a desperate sally against besieging Anglo-Burgundian forces at Compiègne. As Joan heroically covered the retreat of her men, the city gates were abruptly closed behind her, cutting her off from safety. Surrounded and overwhelmed, she fought valiantly, but it was a hopeless struggle. Pulled from her horse, the Maid of Orleans was captured by a Burgundian archer, her freedom, and perhaps her destiny, brutally extinguished in a fateful trap. Her voices had warned her of capture, but she had pressed on, driven by an unyielding sense of duty. Joan of Arc's capture was a prize beyond measure for the English. For months, she remained a prisoner of the Burgundians, but the English recognized her true value. They entered into negotiations, and for a hefty sum of 10,000 livres tournois, equivalent to a king's ransom, they purchased her. Their intention was clear and chillingly calculated, not to execute her as a prisoner of war, but to discredit her, and by extension, King Charles VII. If Joan could be proven a heretic or a sorceress, then her divine revelations were false, and the coronation of Charles VII, which she orchestrated, would be rendered illegitimate. The battlefield had been lost. Now, the English planned to win the war in the courtroom, turning faith itself into their deadliest weapon against France. Joan was taken to Rouen, the English administrative capital in France, to face an ecclesiastical court. This was no impartial quest for truth, but a politically motivated farce, meticulously orchestrated by the English. Presiding was Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, a staunch English ally, surrounded by over 100 French clerics, nearly all of whom sided with the English or Burgundian cause. Joan was denied legal counsel, interrogated for months without respite, and subjected to relentless questioning designed to trap her into heresy. Confined in an English prison, she was isolated, vulnerable, and facing a court whose verdict was effectively predetermined. The deck was stacked, the outcome desired, and the stage set for a judicial murder disguised as a theological inquiry. Despite months of grueling interrogation, deprivation, and psychological torment, Joan of Arc remained remarkably steadfast. Her accusers, learned theologians and shrewd lawyers, sought to break her spirit, to twist her words, to force her to renounce her divine voices. Yet, time and again, Joan displayed astonishing intelligence, wit, and an unshakable faith that baffled her tormentors. When asked if she was in a state of grace, a theological trap, she famously retorted, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God keep me so." Her answers were sharp, direct, and often revealed a deeper spiritual wisdom than her educated inquisitors possessed. Even in her isolation, Facing an overwhelming power, Joan's defiant spirit burned brightly, a testament to her profound conviction. For months, Joan endured relentless interrogation, her fate hanging by a thread. The English-backed ecclesiastical court, determined to break her, presented a stark choice: recant her voices and mission, or face the flames of heresy. Terrified of immediate execution and the damnation of her immortal soul, Joan, barely 19, momentarily wavered. On May 24, 1431, in the cemetery of Saint-Ouen, she signed a document of abjuration, admitting her errors. The relief was palpable, yet short-lived. Confined to an English prison, denied access to female clothing, and constantly threatened, Joan's resolve rekindled. Within days, she recanted her recantation, declaring she had betrayed her divine voices and her true self. Her captors, now armed with proof of relapse, sealed her tragic fate, condemning her to death for heresy. The morning of May 30th, 1431, dawned gray and heavy in Rouen. Stripped of her hair and dressed in a simple gown, Joan was led through jeering crowds to the old market square, a towering pyre awaiting her. Her last request, a crucifix to gaze upon. An English soldier fashioned a small wooden cross for her, while a Dominican friar held a larger one aloft for her to see above the rising flames. With unwavering courage, she called out the name of Jesus repeatedly as the fire consumed her. Her death was brutal, designed to erase her memory, but it achieved the opposite. The English scattered her ashes in the Seine, fearing relics. Yet in doing so, they cast her legend far and wide. Joan of Arc died a martyr, her sacrifice transforming her from a condemned heretic into an enduring symbol of faith and defiance. Though her earthly life ended in flames, Joan's story was far from over. Her death ignited a spark that would burn for centuries, transforming her into a national heroine. King Charles VII, whose crown she secured, initiated a posthumous retrial in 1450, clearing her name. In 1456, the original verdict was overturned, declaring her trial riddled with fraud and malice. From a literate peasant girl to a revered figure, Joan's journey continued even after death. The Catholic Church, recognizing her profound impact and spiritual conviction, finally canonized her as Saint Joan of Arc in 1920. She stands today as an enduring symbol of French identity, of courage against overwhelming odds, of unwavering faith, and of the extraordinary power of an individual to change the course of history. Her light, extinguished too soon, continues to inspire millions worldwide. From the quiet fields of Domrémy to the roaring battlefields, from the awe-inspiring ceremony of a king's coronation to the stark confines of an enemy prison, Joan of Arc's journey remains one of history's most captivating and improbable tales. She was a peasant girl who dared to defy the age, a military genius who reshaped a war, and a spiritual icon whose faith moved mountains and armies. Against impossible odds, she inspired a nation, resurrected a monarchy, and forever altered the trajectory of France. Her story is a potent testament to the duality of human experience, the unwavering conviction of divine inspiration clashing with the brutal realities of human conflict and political intrigue. We've witnessed her triumphs, celebrated her courage, and grappled with the tragic injustice of her end. Yet, even in martyrdom, her spirit ignited a flame that burned brighter, forging a national identity and a legacy that transcends time and borders. Joan of Arc is more than a historical figure. She is a universal symbol, a beacon of courage for the downtrodden, a testament to faith in the face of despair, and an enduring emblem of the individual's power to profoundly influence destiny. Her life forces us to ask, what drives true heroism? What does it mean to stand firm in one's convictions? And what improbable futures can be forged when one person, against all expectations, answers a calling that changes the world? Her echo resonates still inspiring generations to believe that even the humblest among us can achieve the extraordinary.